In 1993, a man drew a shape on a napkin-sized sketch that did not exist anywhere on Earth yet, not because nobody had thought of it, but because the piece of ground it needed to stand on had not been invented. Today, that sketch is 321 meters of glass, steel, and Teflon, standing alone in the Arabian Gulf. And to build it, an entire nation had to manufacture the land beneath it from open seawater before they were even allowed to lay a single brick. This is the story of how Dubai built the most photographed hotel on the planet on ground that, 5 years earlier, was simply ocean. And by the time you reach the middle of this story, you will understand why engineers who worked on it still call it, quietly, impossible. It begins with a ruler and an image. Sheikh Mohammed wanted one single structure that the world would recognize before it recognized Dubai itself. Not a hotel first, an image first, and architect Tom Wright answered with something almost too simple. The shape of a dhow sail, one of the oldest silhouettes in Arab seafaring history, blown up 400 times its size and rebuilt in concrete and fabric. But there was no site for it. Not really. The only place large enough, dramatic enough, isolated enough to let this shape stand alone against the sky was 280 meters offshore, sitting on nothing but open water. So before a single steel beam went up, before a single hotel room was designed, engineers had to solve a problem that had nothing to do with architecture at all. How do you build a foundation for a 300-meter tower in the middle of the sea, when the bedrock, strong enough to hold it, sits more than 180 meters below the surface, buried far too deep to ever reach? The answer was almost unthinkable. Forget the bedrock entirely. Instead, engineers designed 230 concrete piles, each one 40 meters long and 1.5 meters wide, driven not down to solid rock, but simply deep, enough into the seabed sand to hold on through friction alone. The sheer grip of packed sand along the full length of every single pile, an approach with almost no margin for being wrong. On July 8, 1994, a barge anchored over open water, marked only by buoys, lowered a hydraulic hammer, and drove the very first pile into a seabed that had never held a building in its entire geological history. Blow after blow, pile after pile, a hidden forest of concrete began growing beneath the waves, invisible from the surface, while temporary steel walls rose around the footprint to hold back the sea long enough for engineers to build permanent land inside them. Every single pile had to be load tested before construction could continue, and in 1 week alone, the equivalent of 70,000 tons was tested into that seabed, rearranging the floor of the Gulf one pile at a time. Once all 230 piles were driven, the truly strange part began. Engineers had to create the island itself, pumping sand and water together into the space between the temporary walls, watching hour by hour as slurry displaced seawater and land began appearing where there had only ever been ocean. Move too fast, and the retaining walls could buckle under the pressure. Move too slow, and an already brutal 5-year schedule would begin slipping away. Vibratory probes were driven into the new fill to compact the loose, saturated sand, because sand that has just been pumped out of a slurry mixture cannot hold up a hotel on its own. It has to be forced dense, packed tight enough to trust. Around the new island's edge, engineers placed something that had never been used in Gulf construction before. Honeycomb-shaped concrete armor blocks, designed not to fight the waves head-on, but to let the wave energy bleed harmlessly through the structure instead of slamming straight into it. A seawall built to survive a storm that statistically only happens once every 100 years. That seawall rose 7.5 meters above sea level, tall enough that the lowest floors of the future hotel would sit protected behind it, no matter what the Gulf threw at the island in the decades ahead. 3 full years passed before this artificial ground was finally ready. Trimmed, leveled, waterproofed. Once was every single pile head cut to within 5 millimeters of the exact same elevation, so the enormous concrete raft above it could sit perfectly flat. That raft alone required 70,000 cubic meters of concrete, poured in one continuous operation that could not stop for a single hour, because any pause would create what engineers call a cold joint. A hidden seam of weakness locked permanently into the foundation of a building meant to stand for a century. Cooling pipes were cast directly into the raft before the pour even began, because concrete this massive generates enough internal heat while curing to crack itself apart from within if nobody controls it, and crews ran cold water through those pipes round the clock, logging the internal temperature every single hour to keep it below 70 degrees. And after everything, the piles, the island, the 70,000 tons of concrete, the hotel itself had not even begun to rise yet. Only now could the real climb start, using a jump form system that essentially rides up the building as it grows, climbing floor by floor with no scaffolding running from the ground to the top, workers literally riding the formwork up the same structure they were pouring beneath them. Each slab was engineered with post-tensioned steel tendons threaded through the concrete, stressed tight after every pour, so the floor permanently squeezes itself into compression, resisting sag for decades under its own weight. Floor by floor, pour, stress, strip, and fly the forms to the next level. The exact same sequence, repeated 56 times all the way to the top, until the bare concrete core stood 321 meters above the gulf, completely naked, unclad, and already unmistakably shaped like the mast of a ship, 400 meters from the nearest solid land in any direction, with absolutely nowhere to step back and look at it from a safe distance. Then came 9,000 tons of structural steel, delivered by barge, forming an exoskeleton that would wrap the entire building on the outside rather than hide inside it. Every beam bolted to anchor plates that had been cast into the concrete weeks earlier, every single bolt torqued to a precise specification, because this steel frame was not decoration. It was the structure that would absorb the full force of Gulf wind loading for the rest of the building's life. Workers climbed that exposed steel grid with nothing but a harness and their own balance, bolting diagonal cross-bracing into place 2 at a time, doubling the stiffness of the frame with every brace added 300 meters above open water. From the south face of the tower, engineers cantilevered a restaurant arm 27 meters out into open air, 200 meters above the sea, bolted section by section, built deliberately, over-engineered, because there is no acceptable margin for error when the load hanging off the end of that arm includes an entire working kitchen. At the very top, workers bolted together a helipad with nothing beneath their boots but 210 meters of empty space and the gulf far below, and only once every inch of that exoskeleton was complete could the final piece begin. A specialized Teflon-coated fiberglass fabric cut individually to match the exact curve of the steel grid at every single point on the building. Because the structure curves constantly and no two panel shapes are the same, each fabric panel was hoisted into place and stretched taut with turnbuckles at every corner. And the moment the first section of fabric went up, the building suddenly looked like a sail for the very first time in its existence. A material chosen deliberately because in daylight it glows white against the sky, and at night, lit from within, the entire building becomes a lantern over the gulf. One material, doing both jobs, exactly as designed from that very first sketch back in 1993. Inside, the interior work was, if anything, even more obsessive. An atrium rising 180 meters straight up, the tallest in the world, lined with 22-karat gold leaf pressed onto columns by hand because it is too thin and fragile to even touch with bare fingers. Carrara marble slabs matched panel by panel, so the veining lines up perfectly across every single joint in the lobby. An aquarium wall built from 18 centimeters of acrylic, holding back nearly 1 million liters of water under constant pressure. Custom carpets shipped from South Africa and India, hand-cut so that no two corridors in the entire hotel are identical. Chandeliers hauled up by hand winch, wired floor by floor from scaffolding suspended in open air. Nearly 1,800 square meters of 24-karat gold leaf applied one small sheet at a time, each piece roughly the size of a postage stamp. And still, before a single guest could ever check in, every system in the building had to be proven. Glass elevators tested from the basement to the very top floor before anyone was allowed to ride them. Every sprinkler head triggered, every fire damper cycled, the building's entire. Electrical switchgear energized for the first time and tested under full load, floor by floor, until every last system in the tower was live and verified. On December 1st, 1999, 5 years after the very first pile was driven into open water, the doors finally opened. 230 piles, 70,000 cubic meters of concrete, 9,000 tons of steel, 2,000 workers, $1 billion, an island created from nothing, holding up a building that would go on to define an entire city's skyline before that skyline even existed, because the Burj Al Arab was not built after Dubai became famous. It was built first, deliberately, as the single image the rest of the city would eventually grow around, and every tower that has risen along that coastline since owes its existence in some quiet way to a napkin sketch of a sail and 230 concrete piles driven into empty sea.